Welcome to the 16th video on ancient Greek history. We come now to what's called the First Peloponnesian War, and this occurred roughly between 460 and 445 BC. Now you shouldn't get this confused with what is often called the Great Peloponnesian War, which occurred in 431 BC. And I think the reason they separate the two is not only because they occur at different time periods, but the First Peloponnesian War is far smaller in terms of scale than the Great Peloponnesian War. That's not to minimize the importance of the events that occurred during the First Peloponnesian War, but it's nowhere near the magnitude of the Great Peloponnesian War, which again occurred in 431 BC. So I kind of like to think of the First Peloponnesian War as more like a series of events with a few major battles interspersed here and there. Now, in terms of the Peloponnesian War, one might have expected the Greeks to set aside their numerous grievances after the great victory over Persia in the Greco-Persian Wars. But the competitive spirit of the Greeks was just far too great. Now, there have been some arguments made that possibly there might not have been all this infighting had the Persians conquered them. But then again, the sacrifice would have been the Greeks' freedom. But if we take a look at Asia Minor, where the Persians were far more successful, the city-states there had a long period of relative peace during the time the Persians ruled. So there's this idea that an empire sort of quashes all the internal disputes that occurs between city-states. It sort of keeps everybody in line. So the fact that the Greeks did win the Greco-Persian War allowed this fierce, independent nature of the Greek cities to continue. And so everybody wanted to be top dog. And so I guess it's only a natural evolution that the Greeks eventually would start to point their swords at each other. So it's almost like this sibling rivalry from hell. Now, if you remember in previous videos, we kind of talked about the Spartans being the strongest city-state in Greece before the Persian Wars. They were sort of the baddest dude on the block. And then, of course, after the Greco-Persian Wars, that's not the case anymore. The Athenians begin to form what the Greeks look at as an empire and begin to add a collection of city-states across the Aegean Sea, and these again are collectively formed into what we call the Delian League. But as we mentioned in the last video, this was becoming more like Athens' own league and empire, and so that's a good starting point for the First Peloponnesian War. Now, since Sparta had previously been sort of the godfather of Greece, that is, if you had a problem, you turned to Sparta to get help. Well, now that Athens' moment has finally arrived, you had another option. You didn't necessarily have to go to the Spartans. And if you did go to the Spartans and the Spartans turned you down, you had another city to turn to. So that fact alone, as we will see, will have a prominent impact on the relationships between the various Greek cities. So by 460 BC, things are really starting to spiral downward. And there's this series of quarrels between Athens and her allies and all of the city-states that collectively form the Peloponnesian League. Now, according to Thucydides, who is of course the great historian of the Peloponnesian Wars, the main cause of the wars between Athens and Sparta was the fact that the Spartans feared Athenian growth. And how many times have we seen that in history? Many, many wars were started over that very word, fear. Now, before we get to what's going on in Greece, I should mention that in 457 BC, the Athenians decided to add Egypt to her growing empire. Now, Egypt was fantastically wealthy, and of course at that time is controlled by the Persians. And Egypt is really the Rolls-Royce of the Persian Empire. It really was a huge, huge cash cow for the Persian Empire. So if Athens could add Egypt into the fold, they really would be on their way to forming an invincible empire. And this is really no small enterprise. The Athenians commit a massive fleet and a massive amount of troops to kick the Persians out of Egypt. But we will get back to that later. And again, that occurs in 457 BC. Now, moving back to Greece, there were several events that occurred in the mid-450s that the Spartans saw as aggressive maneuvers by the Athenians. The first involved this business of the earthquake in Sparta. Now, if you remember in the previous video, that earthquake had caused a rebellion by the Helots in the Peloponnesus. Well, the Spartans quelled that rebellion, but as usual, the Helots retreated up to the top of Mount Itomi and refused to come off of the top of that mountain. Well, the Spartans really weren't too interested in climbing the peaks again to get them out of there, so they signed a peace treaty with the Helots that would allow the Helots safe passage out of the Peloponnesus if they would only come down the mountain. And essentially that's what happens. Well, the Athenians get control of a city called Naupactus. Now, if you look on this map down here, it's over this way a little bit to the left. And it's a city that really has command of the entire Corinthian Gulf because of its prominent location. Well, the Athenians had the audacity to give the Helots that colony. And so now one of the bitter enemies of the Spartans has control of a key port in the Corinthian Gulf. And now, if the Spartans want to sail across the Corinthian Gulf, they could be contested not only by the Athenian navy, but also a navy fielded by the Helots at Naupactus. So this really starts to see the relationship between Sparta and Athens deteriorate. Now, at about the same time as the situation in Naupactus, Corinth and Megara go to war. And of course, these are two members of the Peloponnesian League. Well, Megara starts to lose the war to Corinth, and they go to Sparta for help and ask the Spartans for aid. Now, this was kind of a dilemma for Sparta, because if they decided to go ahead and support Megara, they certainly would have angered one of their greatest allies in Corinth. So the Spartans kind of take the easy route and decide to stay out of the conflict. Well, Megara at that point decides to go ahead and enlist the help of Athens and ask them for aid. Now, this is a golden opportunity for the Athenians, because they can set up a defensive line on the isthmus and block the Spartans from entering Attica and mainland Greece. And so predictably, the Athenians take up the Megarian offer and set up defenses in and around the isthmus. And so this act greatly increased the tension between Athens and Sparta. And so now the Athenians have a major strategic advantage over the Spartans. Because where would the Spartans go if they had to invade mainland Greece? Well, they would have to make a very dangerous crossing over the Corinthian Gulf. And of course, the Spartans had nowhere near the capabilities of the Athenians at sea. I should also point out that this permanently damaged the relationship between Corinth and Athens, because up to that point, there really wasn't a long-term history of conflict between the Corinthians and the Athenians. But after that, the Corinthians never forgave Athens for taking sides in their dispute with Megara. And so we will see that Corinthian hatred come into play right before the start of the Great Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. Now, events continue to go Athens' way after they defeat a city-state called Aegina. Now, Aegina had a pretty sizable navy, and it was a navy that was enough to give Athens cause for concern. They had to at least give it some consideration. Well, Athens went to war with Aegina, they defeat them, and now Aegina becomes a tributary to Athens. So now basically Athens is pretty much uncontested at sea all around Greece. So things really are starting to look bad for the Spartans now. But what could the Spartans do about Athens? Well, they were blocked from attacking Athens by way of the isthmus, so an opportunity did arise in a small region in central Greece called Doris. Now, this was home to the Dorians. Now, if you remember, the Dorians were the traditional ancestors of the Spartans. So when they came asking for the Spartans' help in a small little war they had going on, the Spartans decided to accept. Now, do we really think the Spartans cared about this tiny little town called Doris in the middle of central Greece, in the middle of nowhere? Probably not, but they were using that as a pretext to invade Attica, because for certain it was Athens who was in the main sights of the Spartans. But again, how could the Spartans get to central Greece? They were blocked everywhere, at sea and through the isthmus. So the Spartans decide to go ahead and make a dangerous crossing across this Corinthian Gulf. Well, it succeeds, because the Athenian navy was sleepwalking and failed to notice the Spartan ships. So this is really bad news for the Athenians, because now the Spartan army is on the Greek mainland, the very thing they were trying to prevent. Well, the Spartans take care of that little business at Doris, and then proceed to head to the northern border of Attica, poised to take the initiative and attack Athens now. The Spartans also convinced the Boeotians in central Greece to join the cause, so they have a pretty sizable army. So the Athenians go ahead and muster their army to stop the Spartans from ravaging their countryside. And so this battle ensues near the town of Tanagra. Well, the Spartans defeat the Athenians, but it was not the decisive defeat the Spartans were hoping for, because the Spartans wanted to inflict a decisive defeat on the Athenians, and then they could march up to Athens. Well, that doesn't happen. Both sides suffer terrible casualties. So even though the Spartans win the battle, they're forced to go ahead and march back home. Now they're able to march through the isthmus because the Athenians can't contest it, but in a sense it's almost a victory for the Athenians, because the Spartans are no longer in Attica. And this time they can make sure their navy is more attuned and prevents another crossing by the Spartans in the Corinthian Gulf. Well, the Athenian army is resupplied and retooled, and now decides to punish the Boeotians for supporting the Spartans. So they invade Boeotia, and it's pretty successful. They actually convert many of the cities and towns in Boeotia into full-fledged democracies. And so now these are towns that support Athens. And it was at this time that the Athenians were able to complete their long-term project of building a wall all the way from Athens to the port city of Piraeus. So even that was pretty much invulnerable now. So things were looking pretty good for the Athenians here. They had the north blocked at Boeotia, they had the Corinthian Sea and all the rest of the seas around Greece blocked, and they had the Isthmus blocked. So in a sense, the Spartans really were hemmed in now in the Peloponnesus. And that is exactly where the Athenians wanted to keep them permanently. But then at the very height, and how many times have we seen this in history, where a military power reaches its absolute height and then things start to go south? Well, that's what happens with Athens. Now, you remember that invasion of Egypt I talked about in the previous slide? Well, the Athenians lose that war, and the Persians hang on to Egypt. And so now there's this danger of destabilization inside the Athenian Empire. And with the prospect of rebellions within the empire looming, the Athenians decide to go ahead and try to seek a truce with the Spartans. And who better to do that than Cimon? Remember him from the previous video? Well, they recall him in 451. And Cimon does what he's always good at. He convinces the Spartans to go ahead and sign a 5-year truce, with the hope that there will be a longer peace agreement later on. And with that in place, and Cimon restored to power within Athens, he does what everybody wants to do in Greece. He goes on a campaign, and he decides to go after the Persians again. Well, this time it's in Cyprus, and he is victorious, but Cimon dies in the battle. So that leaves Pericles completely in charge. And of course, Pericles doesn't kind of have the sway that Cimon did with the Spartans. And that will have profound effects, as we will see later on during the Great Peloponnesian War. And so after the business with Cimon, the rebellions start to take place in earnest. And of course, it can be tied to that disastrous fiasco in Egypt, because there was no longer this sense that the Athenians were invulnerable. And how many times have we seen that in history? Take a look at World War II. When the Russians finally stopped the Germans at the gates of Moscow, there was this renewed optimism among the Allies because they realized that the Germans weren't invincible. Well, the same kind of deal happens here in the Athenian Empire. And so the first rebellion starts in Boeotia. And the rebellion there takes form, and they kick the Athenians out of central Greece. And so now Boeotia is a hostile place to the Athenians, and that occurred in 447 BC. Next up was the island of Euboea. Now this was cause for serious concern for Athens, because this was one of the member states of the Delian League. And so this rebellion could not be tolerated by Athens. And so Pericles heads up there to put that rebellion down. So while that's going on, Megara decides to join in on the fun, and they rebel against Athens. The rebellion succeeds, and now there is no protection from a Spartan invasion. And guess what? The Spartans take that opportunity to go ahead and march through the Isthmus now, since Megara is now their friend again. Meanwhile, back in Euboea, Pericles is successful. He puts the rebellion down there, and there's some stabilization now within the Delian League. But he's got the Spartans marching around in Attica. So he marches his army back across Attica and meets up with the Spartans. And so now the Spartans have what they've been dreaming about for a while now, another head-to-head matchup with the Athenians. And so they can go ahead and crush them and then march on Athens itself. Well, in one of the most amazing turnarounds in the entire war, nothing happens. The Spartans simply go back home. Now, what on earth is going on here? Well, it's likely neither side wanted another massive battle where there were huge casualties. That didn't serve Athens' purpose, and it certainly didn't serve the purpose of the Spartans, who were always trying to avoid costly wars of attrition. And remember, the Athenians have to worry about more rebellions, and the Spartans, of course, always have to worry about those pesky helots. So they agree on a 30-year peace treaty in 445 BC. But as we will see in the coming videos, it did not last because of something called the Great Peloponnesian War. And we will get to that in the next series of videos.